Hello, my name is Tristan Bunn. I am a lecturer at Massey University's College of Creative Arts. My research and practice explore the intersection of creativity and technology. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing my research and artworks created with a 2-axis pen plotter. Here are just a few slides of some of the artworks I've created. For this one, I was exploring moire patterns. You can see the moire pattern most obviously in the rightmost square shape there. Here I'm exploring different inks, specifically metallic inks. There's a close-up of a metallic ink. And then also combining plots with inkjet prints. So in this case, I generated a raster graphic and then printed that with a inkjet printer, and then over that plotted using a white and silver pen. Here's the environment that I used to generate these artworks. I will discuss this in more detail in this presentation, but in short, on the right-hand side, you have the code editor where I write my code, and each time I run that code, it produces a visual like the one on the left. There's the same visual plotted and a variation. So to begin this presentation, I'm going to discuss the environment that I use, which is a combination of processing and something called Pi5. So for those of you who aren't familiar with processing, processing is an incredibly popular environment for generating graphics using code. It's very popular with people who want to teach creatives how to program in a more sort of visual context, and it includes all sorts of commands specifically aimed at generating graphics. So if you look over here on the left-hand side, you've got the code that is used to generate the graphic on the right. So usually what happens is you will download processing, the IDE, which is depicted on the left-hand side over here. There are other variants, but I'm not going to get into that today. And then what you do is you open it up and you get to type in processing Java code right here in the editor. Then what happens is when you run the code, it is taken through Java, specifically using the processing library, and what you get on the other end is some type of visual output. Now, processing also includes a Python mode. So the big difference over here is that when you've enabled Python mode in processing, you get to enter Python code rather than Java code. Now, for a lot of reasons, I prefer Python code. Without getting into too much detail, I think it's a more approachable language, Python, than Java, when you want to start teaching. And what's more, I find it more expressive when I'm trying to generate graphic output. So the process over here is very simple. The big difference over here is that there is this extra layer called Jython, and that's what's making the magic happen. Essentially, Jython is taking your Python code and translating it into Java, and then from there, it's pretty much the same process. So Jython has some limitations. Of course, it isn't pure Python. What it's doing is it's taking Python code and translating it into Java. So it's not pure C Python. It has limitations. For example, it only supports up to Python 2.7, and it doesn't support third-party Python libraries or C extensions. Now, that sound quite technical right now, and I will get into a bit more detail about why those are limitations and how you can get around them. So another thing I should mention before moving ahead is that you don't have to use processing's editor to write your code. You can use any editor you like. So in this case, the editor depicted on the left-hand side is VS Code. So the idea is you can, as an alternative, use the terminal to run the command line version of processing's Python mode, or alternatively configure your editor to execute that command for you. Now, this is important because the next thing I'm going to talk about is something called Pi5. Now, Pi5 essentially does pretty much the same thing as processing's Python mode, Pi5, however, doesn't integrate into the processing IDE, so you have to use your own editor. So in this case, what I'm doing is I will write the Python code in the editor I prefer to use. And then what happens is instead of using Jython, Pi5 replaces Jython with something called jpipe, which you can see has a logo with a snake sort of staring into a mug. Now, the difference over here is that jpipe doesn't have many of the limitations that Jython has. So from here, you get the same output. So you're still using processing in Java, but there's this new layer that's replacing Jython. Now, because jpipe works differently to Jython, it provides full access to Java libraries with CPython. So it's kind of a pure Python experience. And as a result, it supports Python 3 and above. And what's more, it will give you Python libraries with C extensions. So if anyone is interested in using something like NumPy or matplotlib, these are now options that you could not ordinarily access with processing's Python mode, which uses Jython. So I like to replace the editor in this instance with something called Thonny. As I said, you could use any editor you like, but Thonny is this beginner-aimed code editor specifically for Python, and it has all sorts of neat tools, and I think it's a fantastic replacement for the processing IDE, and it works really nicely with Python. So pretty much the same process as you can see, but I've just replaced the editor here. You can also use Pi5 in a notebook environment. I don't want to get into too much detail about that now. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. I'd like to just thank Jim Schmitz, the creator of the Pi5 project. And if you want to find out more, you can head over to pi5.xero.io or to the project's GitHub repository, which I've listed there. So here's a demonstration of my coding environment. This is a fresh install of Thonny, but if you want to use Pi5, I have created a plugin, a Pi5 plugin for Thonny. So via the plugin manager, you are able to search for and install this. What this will do is install and configure all of the files that you need to run a Pi5 environment. Once you restart Thonny after installing the plugin, there's a new menu. Over here, I have activated Thonny's Pi5 mode. Here I'm going to type some simple processing code, in this case to draw a circle. I will save the file. And now I can run this via the Pi5 menu. Here is an example of one of the programs that I used to plot. So what I'm doing over here is I'm outputting the image as an SVG file and exiting the sketch. I don't really want to run the normal processing window. I just want to output this directly to an SVG file. Now, what I like to do is I like to keep this SVG file open in my image viewer and then hot reload it. So in other words, every time I change the code, in this case, I'll just change the random seed, I can rerun the program and it will refresh the image. Then when I want to plot my creation, I open it with Inkscape. The plotter that I'm using, that's an Axie Draw, has a plugin for Inkscape to plot directly from Inkscape. So in this instance, I am only going to render the red lines so that I have just the lines I need to plot with a red pen. The idea is that I would do this for each color in the graphic. One final note. If you're interested in exploring generative art that you want to plot using 3D, you can do that with processing, but I think Blender is really exciting. The reason that Blender complements my workflow nicely is that Blender also has a Python interface for programming. So think about anything you can do in Blender, you can do programmatically, and you could use that to do all sorts of interesting things. And what's more, if you want to, you can run Blender in a sort of headless mode, and hot reload the image like I was doing with my environment and not have to open Blender at all. As you can see, I'm using my own editor, the terminal, and the image is reloading each time I run this. Here is a visual that I created using Blender and its wireframe renderer, which renders things as SVGs so that you can plot them. And that is a photograph of the plot in action. I just want to say thanks to a few people. Alexandre Villares, he has an extensive repository of information about creative coding with Python. You can check out his GitHub page. And thank you to everyone who's listened to the presentation. If you'd like to reach out to me to discuss more about anything that I've talked about today, I'd love to chat with you. Thank you very much.